Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here, and what I'd like to do in this video is briefly offer some tips for writing your policy paper. There's been some questions that I've been asked, so I thought maybe I'd put together a brief video and hopefully this will assist you. That basically what you're asked to do is to apply the Eightfold Path to a criminal justice policy, and you're going to be following the model in Bardak and Patashnik's book, A Practical Guide for Policy Analysis, 5th edition, published in 2016, Thousand Oaks, California, by Sage Publications. And also you can use as a resource this excellent text by Dr. Gao, The Criminal Justice Policy Origins and Effectiveness, published by Oxford University Press, and there's a lot of very useful ideas, and that book's published 2019. You'll find a lot of examples in there just to give you some ideas in different policies and the alternatives and the criteria used to measure success, and also the outcomes and which policies or programs tend to be more effective than others, and so forth. For example, Dr. Gao, in discussing police policy, looks at order maintenance policing, problem-oriented policing, community policing, and data-driven policing. And then with gun policy, in another chapter, she looks at reducing access to guns to high-risk individuals, also the assault weapon ban and firearm sentence enhancements, as well as concealed carry and gun buybacks. And there's many other chapters that can be very helpful. Another one on sex offender policy takes a look at registration and notification, residency restrictions, as well as civil commitment. Now, the Eightfold Path basically will help guide your paper, and I would actually recommend using each of the steps as a heading, and then you may even have some subheadings with that. That will help you to organize your paper and help us to see that you've gone through the 8-step process. So this is really a problem-solving process, if you will. Define the problem, assemble some evidence, construct alternatives, select the criteria, project the outcomes, confront the trade-offs, and then decide which alternative you're going to use and tell your story. The authors, Bardak and let's see, who's the second author there? Bardak and Patashnik. I've been using this book. I have several volumes over the years. It's an excellent resource. Anyway, they recommend that the steps should not be viewed in a rigid manner, and that the steps may actually overlap, and you may return to a step. You don't have to follow that particular order. Some steps may actually already be constructed for you, and that also when you're putting together a policy analysis, it's always useful to think about the conflicts and the community aspects and political aspects that you'd have to face. An example is provided in Appendix A, which might be helpful to look at. I'm going to apply the Eightfold Path to a different problem, and one that I have some familiarity with from my previous work before I went into the academic setting. Okay, so I'm going to go through the steps and then try to provide some and try to provide an example to kind of clarify things, see if that helps out. Step 1 is to define the problem. You want to identify and define the problem, and you want to you want to look at the research, and you want to look at other policy pieces, and you want to look at the official data. Basically, how is the problem defined by other researchers, policy analysts, and public officials? A lot of times, problem will be defined in terms of deficit and excess. And you may also look at the history or emergence of the problem if you'd like. Many times you would quantify the problem or use a range in that regard. And the authors point out that you should not include the solution to the problem in your problem definition. You're going to get to that later, so you just want to state the problem. In this case, I'm going to run through the case of the problem of high rates of child abuse in a community. So, and let's get even more specific, that we have a problem, let's say, in a community where there's high rates of child physical abuse reported to Child Protective Services. And let's say that that is going to be our problem for going through these steps. So we also might want to go ahead then and with that, defining the problem, we can go ahead and get started by taking a look at what is provided in the research or in policy reports or agency reports, for example. And so we might specify in that particular community that the rate of child physical abuse, reported child physical abuse was, and then we put in that particular number and cite the source. And so then we move to assembling some evidence. That's step 2. Step 2 is assembling some evidence, and that's where we want to present the relevant evidence that the problem actually exists. We're going to be more detailed here. We might also point out some of the potential causes of the problem. So here we're collecting evidence from research studies, from policy studies, from agency reports, so we know what's going on here. And so, for example, here we might look at the trends in of reported child physical abuse in the community, and we might begin to look at if a certain percentage was classified as severe. We might look at the number of fatalities that occurred. We might look at repeat cases that occurred within the year. We might look at different outcomes. We'll get to that later. But here we basically want to try to understand, okay, so we know that child physical abuse is a problem. We know the extent of it. We know some of the different numbers if we start looking at like age groups or other factors associated, and that gets us maybe into some of the possible causes of the problem. We might find that that child physical abuse is reported more frequently in certain neighborhoods, or it's reported more frequently in certain age groups, or it's reported more frequently based on socioeconomic status. And so we start, taking a closer look at the problem in that regard and assembling some evidence on that in step 2. Step 3 is constructing alternatives. Okay, here we want to construct alternative policy options or interventions to solve or reduce the problem. So often you'll look at several alternatives and then look at best practices. Okay, I'm sorry, a cat just walked across my computer and minor disruption there. Let me get my train of thought back to where I was. That happens sometimes. Okay, step 3, construct the alternatives. Here you will construct the alternative policy options or interventions to solve or reduce the problem. And again, you would usually include several alternatives. You're going to eventually select one of those and say, hey, this is the one to use, and here's why, here's what we can expect, and that is one that you'll go into more detail. So you want to look for the best practices, and also something that would be acceptable. And in this case, let's say that I was to select several policies related to reducing child physical abuse with by recommending as policies that we implement different programs, such as a visiting nurse program, perhaps, or a early identification program in the school system, or a mass media campaign to try to reduce child physical abuse, or an expansion of parenting programs in the communities, or an increase in funding for training and retention of Child Protective Service workers. So there's some options. Like I said, if you have 3, that would, I think, be sufficient for what we're doing here. And so you want to look at either existing policies or programs, modify policies or programs, or build new policies. So this is the part where you might say that you want to look at this particular policy, and it may be one that already exists and you have all that information, or maybe one that you're modifying, or it may be one you're building new, and you'll have to look at some existing research to support that if it's available. I'm going to make it easy in this case by selecting a program, as you'll see, that has research behind it. So in step 4, you select the criteria. Here, what criteria will you use to know if your alternative was successful? How will you measure the outcomes of each alternative that you described in step 3? Often in criminal justice, we'd use recidivism rates or crime rates. In this case, we're going to use reporting rates of child physical abuse to Child Protective Services. And you can certainly have multiple criteria. And I might say over when the program's implemented, we're going to look at reduction every year, up to 5 years, and then decide whether or not we would continue the program, depending on whether it appears to be effective or not. The authors point out, and I quote from page 45 from Bardak and Patashnik, that alternatives are courses of action, whereas criteria are mental standards for evaluating the results of action. So think about that. Alternatives are courses of action, whereas criteria are mental standards for evaluating the results of action. So you don't want to get those confused. And also in step 4, selecting criteria, your authors provide a wealth of information about some commonly used criteria, including efficiency, cost, equality, fairness, justice, freedom, community, legality, political acceptability, and robustness and improvability. Of course, we're probably going to be using lowering rates of certain crimes, or reducing recidivism, or reducing opioid use, something of that sort, or opioid deaths, or opioid related arrests, whatever the case might be. That probably is going to be a little more straightforward with what we're doing here. And then in step 5, what you would do is you would project the outcomes. In other words, how do you think your alternatives will work on your selective outcome? So you want to look back at those, several alternatives you have, and say, well, what does the research show in terms of, maybe one of those policies or programs has been shown to be very effective. Another one has been shown to have some problems. Another one maybe has been shown that actually has a backfire effect, and it makes things worse, and then another program may work, but maybe not as well as that one, and so on. So you're evaluating each alternative against the criteria you selected in step 4, which is a reduction of reported child physical abuse cases to Child Protective Services. And then in step 6, you confront the trade-offs. So here in step 6, you begin to look at what are the benefits and the disadvantages of each. Now in step 5, you've kind of projected the outcomes, how you think it would work. You're evaluating each alternative against the criteria you selected in step 4, and then and that's step 5. And then in step 6, confront the trade-offs. Take a close look at the trade-offs between the alternatives that you've selected. And a lot of times you might say, well, in terms of ease of implementing, costs, acceptability to the community, potential for success, and so you're bringing all that in, and then in step 7, you select the alternative that you want to use. Let's say in this case, I say, based on looking at costs, acceptability, implementation, success rate of previous programs, I'm going with the visiting nurse program, where we'll have a specially trained a group of nurses follow up over a 5-year period with parents who are, or children who are at high risk for being physically abused. And so that's what I decide on. And then in step 8, you kind of tell your story about, well, what you're going to do, why you're going to do it. You kind of summarize those first 7 steps in a couple paragraphs. So hopefully that helps. On a side note, and I won't go on and on and on, I've been working in the field for a long time. I started off my career working in Child Protective Services in a specialized unit in a hospital setting. So I saw hundreds of cases of all kinds of child abuse and also neglect. And it was very frustrating in many ways that it seemed like the cases just kept coming in, that every day I'd have, new cases, or our team would have new cases, and even sometimes we'd have child fatalities which would come through the hospital. Most of my cases I saw were sex crimes against children, but we also often would see combination of abuse and neglect occurring in a large proportion of our cases. I got burned out, to be quite honest about it, but I still wanted to see what I could do outside of the actual setting. 4 years working in that particular Child Protective Services unit, and then another 3 working in a private forensic practice. That was enough. But my colleague and I did write a couple books. Our first book is Child Abuse and Neglect, Multidisciplinary Approaches, where we started to talk about this. And this is related to policy. We talk about recognizing different types of child abuse and neglect. We talked about theories. Then we talked about the multidisciplinary team approach, the process of diagnosing, assessing, and interviewing in child abuse cases, and then treatment, and then program evaluation. And then we actually had a chapter on prevention of child abuse and neglect, and had a little section on politics and policy. Much later, my colleague, Dr. Mara, and I went ahead and published another book called When Teachers, Clergy, and Caretakers Sexually Abuse Children and Adolescents. So you can see that we began to move our work into a much more narrow, specialized area. And here we talk about, obviously, the main focus here is on children and offenders in religious institutions and in the school system. And again, we talk about theories, we talk about the epidemiology and typologies related specifically to clergy and teachers, also diagnosing and interviewing perpetrators. We have a section on that. But here's what I think it was real important. Chapter 5 is burnout and vicarious trauma among those working in the field. That's a whole nother area that's been neglected, that I think is extremely important, and I try to teach about that, that there's high rates of burnout and vicarious trauma, just as there is in the law enforcement field, the corrections field, and so the emergency personnel field, and so on. So we talk about that, and a whole chapter is devoted to that. And then we also have a chapter on technology and sex crimes, and then we have a chapter on treatment of offenders, and then also prevention and policy. And in our treatment chapter, we actually compare and contrast different programs and look at their effectiveness using the primary criteria out there of recidivism rates, usually 5 years out and sometimes up to 20 years out, looking at a whole bunch of different studies. So just to kind of give you an example there. And then if we were going to select a program, we would use the data from other studies to evaluate what we think would work best. So there's no real right way to go about doing this. And I think really being a critical thinker, being creative, being innovative, that's really the important part there. And that's why I've kept working in the field, I have a couple of publications, chapters and books, and trying to see I would have liked to have seen things move quicker. That when I started working in Child Protective Services, I was 21 years old, and right out of my undergrad program. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from UCF, 1984, before we basically had personal computers. And our phones were like this, you know. We didn't even have fax machines back then. Anyway, my whole thought process here is looking back, what policies could have we implemented to move things along quicker, to make things better? I mean, we have made a lot of progress, no doubt, but it's been just excruciatingly slow, and that's been frustrating as well. So a lot of times when we're creating policies, at least when I go about doing it, I think about ones I feel strongly about, that I think are doable, that we can help with. And I think if that's something that connects with you, you'll have a much more pleasant experience putting together your paper. And you know, basically I'm saying select something that you really feel passionate about, that you have a great interest in. And I think that's helpful as well. I hope these tips have been helpful. If you have any questions at all, you can email us and contact us. We'll get back with you. And I apologize. This is the actual second video I made. The first one was 21 minutes, and I thought that was way too long. This one is just about 22 minutes. So thank you.